Before everything unraveled on that sun-bleached dock, before handcuffs, accusations, and the sudden crash of authority meeting consequences, she stood alone at the chain-link fence with the wind tugging at her jacket, staring at a Navy destroyer easing in a harbor like a steel giant returning from some forgotten war. There was something strange about the way she watched it, not with excitement, not with awe, but with a quiet knowing, the expression of someone who'd seen what came before the homecoming. Make sure to like and subscribe if you believe that sometimes the quietest person in the crowd carries the heaviest history, because what happened next was the kind of story people pretend could never happen on a U.S. Navy base, yet it did, right under the morning sun. Riley Hart didn't look like someone anyone should have suspected of anything. 28 years old, hair tied in a practical knot at the nape of her neck, a soft charcoal hoodie pulled over a plain black t-shirt, and a compact medical backpack slung over one shoulder. She blended into the crowd of waiting families like a ghost moving through a world she no longer fully belonged to. She kept her head down, fingers lightly gripping the fence, watching the ship's crew lining the rails. From far away you'd think she was just another girlfriend, sister, or cousin waiting for someone on board, but the truth was tucked deep in her eyes that moved with the scanning, deliberate precision of someone who had once been trained to assess danger before it had a chance to breathe. The dock buzzed with energy as families pressed against barricades, waving signs and shouting names. Navy flags snapped in the breeze. Kids hopped up and down. A brass band practiced the same 4 notes over and over. And through it all, Riley maneuvered alone, stepping around groups, sliding between clusters of onlookers, aiming not for the welcome home section, but for the restricted access walkway leading toward the SEAL arrival zone, an area marked with big red letters that meant authorized personnel only. Her visitor's pass was in her pocket, a laminated badge with a temporary barcode printed in black ink, but the closer she walked toward the restricted gate, the more she felt the invisible line between what she used to be and what she was now. She wasn't in uniform anymore, hadn't been for almost 2 years. The Navy felt like another lifetime, though sometimes her body betrayed her, her spine perfectly straight, posture unconsciously military, every step measured like she expected the ground beneath her to shift into sand or rubble at any moment. She exhaled slowly and kept walking. She was supposed to meet someone. Chief Mason Cole, a SEAL whose name she hadn't spoken aloud in a long time, whose life she had held between her hands in a collapsing building halfway across the world. His team's return was the first time their paths had crossed since that nightmare. And although he had insisted she come, insisted she stand with the unit as an honored guest, the reality of it felt foreign, like a suit she wasn't sure she could fit back into. She touched the strap of her backpack, grounding herself. She could do this. Just walk forward. But fate had a way of intercepting her. 2 steps from the restricted path, a sharp voice cut across the walkway. "Ma'am, hold it right there." She looked up. A young master-at-arms, barely mid-20s, crisp uniform, squared shoulders, jaw set in the brittle confidence of someone eager to prove himself. His name tape read Tanner. His hand hovered near his duty belt, not threatening, just official, the stance of someone who had memorized the handbook more thoroughly than the behavior of real human beings. "You can't go down this walkway," he said, planting himself in front of her like he expected her to sprint past him. "Family and press on the other side. This area is for SEAL personnel and command staff only." Riley nodded slightly. "I'm meeting someone down there." "I'm sure you think you are." Tanner replied with the kind of smile that wasn't a smile at all. "But this isn't a sightseeing area. Please return to the general access zone." She reached for the visitor pass in her pocket. "I have clearance." He didn't even glance at it. "Passes don't grant access to this lane. Only sponsors, staff, or immediate SEAL family. You're not on my list." Riley tried again, keeping her voice level, steady, non-confrontational. "Chief Mason Cole invited me. He's expecting me down there." The name should have meant something. It didn't. Tanner's eyebrows lifted with pitying skepticism. "Right? And I'm dating Beyoncé." Another master-at-arms, older, broader, with a heavy mustache, stepped beside Tanner, arms crossed. "What do we have?" "Possible breach attempt," Tanner said, giving Riley the kind of sideways evaluation usually reserved for shoplifters and drunk tourists. "She's claiming she's been invited by a SEAL." The mustached officer snorted. "Everyone claims they know a SEAL. Riley opened her mouth to answer, but Tanner held up his hand. "Ma'am, I'm going to need to see that pass. And your ID." Now a crowd was watching. It always happened like this. The moment someone in uniform raised their voice even a little, heads turned, families whispered, and suddenly Riley felt like she was back in the Middle East, surrounded by a dozen sets of eyes judging her worth before even hearing her speak. She handed over the pass. Tanner studied it like he was examining a forged passport. "This barcode looks printed," he muttered. "They're all printed," Riley replied. "It was issued at the visitors center 20 minutes ago." "You in the military?" the mustached officer asked, tone implying he already knew the answer. "I was." Tanner smirked. "Let me guess, Army? Air Force? Coast Guard? Navy?" she said quietly. "Sure you were," he murmured. "Where's your uniform then?" She didn't answer. She didn't need to. The uniform wasn't the only thing she'd taken off after leaving that last deployment. Tanner exhaled dramatically. "Ma'am, I'm not going to argue. You're in a restricted zone. If you can't provide proof you belong here, I'm detaining you until command sorts it out." Riley's stomach tightened. Not in fear. In embarrassment. In frustration. In the familiar ache of being misread, underestimated, and dismissed because she no longer carried the insignia that once shielded her from questions. She looked past the officers toward the dock. She could see SEALs beginning to disembark. She could see Mason limping slightly, the same injury she had dressed under fire. And she knew he would turn, scan the crowd, expect to see her. But she couldn't move. Tanner took a step closer. "Ma'am, this is your last warning." And that was the moment everything began to go terribly, terribly wrong. Tanner's last warning still hung in the air when the older master-at-arms stepped forward and reached for Riley's arm, the kind of practiced, indifferent grip used on drunk civilians outside a bar, not on invited guests. And for a split second Riley's body tensed with the sharp, involuntary muscle memory of someone who'd once been taught 100 ways to break out of a hold without thinking. She didn't move. Not yet, because movement would only confirm exactly what they already suspected about her, that she didn't belong, that she was a problem, that she was a threat. But the moment his fingers closed around her forearm, her sleeve slid back just enough to expose the edge of the ink she usually kept hidden, a jagged curve of black, the tail end of a serpent wrapped around the tines of a trident, a fragment so small most people would mistake it for nothing. Most people. Not the lieutenant approaching from the far end of the walkway, his footsteps sharp and fast, his expression carved from irritation as he flipped through a clipboard of names while moving with the clipped efficiency of a man perpetually behind schedule. Lieutenant Avery Locke was known on the base for being strict, no-nonsense, and unyieldingly orderly. He was not known for patience, especially not toward civilians who wandered where they didn't belong. He looked up from the clipboard just as Tanner began to pull Riley backward, and whatever reprimand he'd been about to bark died on his tongue. He didn't even seem fully conscious of why he'd frozen, only that something, some instinct honed over deployments and briefings and 1,000 whispered accounts, told him he needed to look again. Really look. He stepped closer, eyes narrowing, his irritation unraveling into something sharper, colder, more alert. "Hold on," he said, low and sudden. Tanner straightened like a startled rabbit. "Sir, she was trying to access the SEAL lane without permission. I said hold on." Locke's gaze dropped to Riley's forearm, and this time he saw it. The entire design as the sleeve slipped farther, the unmistakable emblem inked into her skin with deliberate, ritualistic precision. The serpent coiled around the SEAL trident's points, the broken scalpel crossing the stem, and beneath it the letters JTMSD-7 and a date burned into the ink like a scar. The lieutenant's face drained of color so quickly it was almost visible, like someone had pulled the life out of him with a siphon. He took a half step back, then another. His throat worked once before sound found him. "Where did you get that?" he asked. But it wasn't the accusation Tanner expected. It was something else. "Oh, fear. Recognition." Riley's voice was soft. "Same place everyone else who has it got theirs." Tanner blinked, confused. "Sir? What's going on?" The mustached officer let go of Riley's arm, his grip falling away as if her skin had suddenly turned radioactive. Lieutenant Locke exhaled slowly, the sound shaky, controlled only by habit and rank. "That tattoo," he said, not looking away from her, "is restricted. It's not just a unit identifier. It's the mark given to members of Joint Tactical Medical Support Team 7. Tanner's confusion twisted into annoyance. And what exactly is that? Some kind of medic group? Locke turned sharply, eyes blazing with a fury Tanner didn't understand. It's not some medic group, Sailor. JTMSD is the embedded medical detachment that supports Tier 1 operations. They go in with the SEALs. They go where we don't talk about. They're the reason some of our platoons come home at all. Tanner's mouth opened, closed, then opened again. That can't be real. She's too young. Riley finished quietly. So were most of us. Locke's gaze flicked between her eyes and the tattoo like he was trying to piece together a ghost story he'd only ever heard in classified after-action briefings. The Al-Hudud ambush, he murmured, the words sounding like they were being dragged from a locked vault. JTMSD 7, only 2 survivors. His eyes widened, breath catching. But he didn't finish, because just then a shout carried across the dock. Hart. Riley's head snapped toward the voice. Chief Mason Cole, taller now than she remembered, broader, the limp more pronounced as he stepped off the ramp with a crutch under one arm, was pushing past 2 ensigns trying to corral him toward a photo area. His eyes swept the crowd, sharp despite exhaustion, and the moment he saw Riley surrounded by 3 armed MAs, something in him detonated. Without waiting for permission, he shoved through the barrier rope and limped straight toward them, fury storming across his face. Tanner instinctively reached for his belt again. The older MA stepped in front of Riley like she was a detainee needing containment. But Mason Cole wasn't slowing down. Lieutenant, he barked, voice carrying over the wind. Why the hell is she in cuffs? Cuffs? Tanner echoed, startled. We didn't cuff her, sir. Yet, the mustached officer muttered. We were about to. Mason's eyes went dark. He stopped inches from the 3 of them, shoulders squared despite the pain it obviously caused him. Lieutenant Locke, he said, voice low. I invited her. Personally. I sent the request to command. She belongs here more than any of us. Tanner's face crumpled into disbelief. Chief, she said you invited her, but we weren't sure. She doesn't look like a SEAL? Mason snapped. She's not. She's the reason half my team is still alive. Locke swallowed hard. Chief, she has the mark. Mason huffed a humorless laugh. She earned it. He turned to Riley, his expression softening for the first time. Document. You okay? She nodded once. I'm fine. You don't look fine, he muttered. You look like you're about to have flashbacks just from dealing with these clowns. Riley's lips twitched. Maybe a little. And that was when the watching families began to piece it together. Whispering rippled through the crowd. A few sailors stepped closer. Then an ensign darted off toward the command tent. Riley felt the shift in the air, the heaviness of attention gathering like a storm cloud, just as the lieutenant straightened his uniform like he knew what was coming and needed to brace himself. Because once command arrived, once they saw her, once they saw the tattoo, once they saw the SEAL chief standing guard like a sentinel, it wouldn't just be an apology. It wouldn't even be a reprimand. It would be a reckoning, and it was already on its way. By the time Commander Rourke reached the scene, the entire energy of the dock had transformed. What began as a simple confrontation had grown into a strange, electric stillness, the kind that settles when people sense they're witnessing something significant, but don't yet understand why. Rourke's boots struck the pavement in long, commanding strides, his shoulders squared, his expression the hardened calm of a man who had seen too much to be easily rattled. Yet even he faltered for a fraction of a second when he spotted Riley standing between the Master-at-Arms trio and Chief Mason Cole. His gaze snapped down to her forearm, to the exposed ink Locke had already identified, and the controlled breath he exhaled wasn't the breath of a commander evaluating a situation. It was the breath of a survivor recognizing another survivor. Hart, he said, voice low with something dangerously close to gratitude. You shouldn't be standing on this side of the rope. You should be with the unit. The crowd erupted in startled murmurs. Tanner went rigid. The older MA blinked like he'd been slapped awake. Lieutenant Locke straightened sharply, stepping back to give the commander room. Rourke approached Riley slowly, as if realizing how close she had come to being shoved face first into the ground by people who didn't know the ghost they were manhandling. Sir, Riley said quietly, instinctively attempting a half salute before catching herself. She didn't wear the uniform anymore. Rourke saw the motion and shook his head. Not today. Not with me. You earn the right to stand however you want. Then he turned, not gently, toward the three MAs. Who detained her? His voice wasn't loud, but it didn't need volume. It had the weight of consequence behind it. Tanner swallowed so hard Riley heard it. Sir. She approached the restricted lane without proper identification, and her behavior? Mason cut in, scoffing. What behavior? Standing. The mustached MA tried again, choosing his words with trembling care. Sir, she didn't look like. Well, she wasn't dressed as someone who served. Rourke finished for him. As someone who dragged wounded operators out of a collapse zone while under mortar fire? As someone who lost half her detachment and still held the line long enough for my platoon to break contact. Silence. Pure, suffocating silence. The type that landed like a hammer on every conscience within earshot. Riley shifted, uncomfortable with the attention pressing against her from every direction. But Mason stepped closer, not in front of her, but beside her, subtly anchoring her in place as if to remind her she wasn't alone anymore. Not today. Rourke lifted his chin at Locke. Lieutenant. Report. Locke inhaled deeply, shame etched into every line of his posture. Sir, I approached assuming she was attempting unauthorized entry. I misjudged. Gravely. Rourke echoed, eyes narrowing. Tanner opened his mouth impulsively. Riley saw it coming and winced internally, but he was already committed. Sir, with respect, she didn't show any proof. Rourke snapped his gaze toward him, and Tanner froze. She is the proof, sailor. Tanner paled. The commander turned slowly back to Riley, and the hard lines in his face softened. Hart, you didn't deserve any of this. She shrugged weakly. It's fine. No, Rourke said, shaking his head with finality. It isn't. Then, for the first time since he'd approached, the commander's expression shifted into something almost ceremonial. He extended his hand, not for a handshake, but palm down, the gesture of a SEAL inviting someone into a formation. Come on, Hart. Your place is with us today. Riley hesitated. She wasn't SEAL. She'd never worn their trident. She had supported them, bled beside them, saved them, but she hadn't been one of them. She started to open her mouth to remind him of that, but Mason nudged her shoulder gently. Doc, he muttered, stop thinking so damn hard and get over here. Riley let out a soft, almost disbelieving breath and stepped forward. Rourke positioned her between himself and Mason, forming a small but unmistakably protective triangle around her as they walked toward the SEAL section. And the whispers began again, not mocking, not doubtful this time. Curious, respectful, reverent. As families realized who she was, the energy changed completely. A few sailors straightened as she passed. A couple of officers nodded to her with a recognition they couldn't voice publicly. The brass band stopped tuning altogether. When Riley reached the edge of the dock where the returning platoon was gathering, the talking died to a hush. And then, something unexpected happened. One of the younger SEALs, someone Riley barely remembered except for the way he'd clutched her arm while she stitched him up during the evacuation, stepped forward and said, voice cracking just a little, Doc Hart. Heads turned. Mason let out a long, weighted exhale beside her. Another SEAL approached, then another, and another, until half the platoon formed a semicircle around her, each one greeting her with a nod, a hand on the shoulder, or a quiet, good to see you, document. She tried to speak and couldn't. Her throat tightened in a way she hadn't felt in years. Not fear, not grief, but something dangerously close to relief. Rourke placed a steady hand on her back. You earned this a long time ago, he murmured. We're just late in giving it to you. Behind them, Tanner and the two MAs remained frozen at the barricade, watching in stunned silence as Riley Hart, plainly dressed, quiet, unassuming Riley, stood in the center of the very men she had once fought to keep alive. And for the first time that day, she didn't feel out of place. She felt seen, not as an intruder, not as an impersonator, not as someone who didn't belong, but as someone who had been part of a story these men would carry for the rest of their lives. A story that, at last, had come home with her. Mason leaned in slightly, voice low enough only she could hear. Told you we'd have your back. Riley breathed out slowly, letting the weight of the moment settle into her bones. Yeah, she whispered. Feels like you finally do. And as the ceremony began, with Riley standing among the SEALs she had once saved, The morning light broke across the harbor in a way that felt like closure, quiet, steady, and earned.